was going to begin by telling you that the top 2 attended exhibitions in London last year, and 3 out of the top 5 and 4 out of the top 10 were from the Royal Academy of Arts, which I'm the artistic director of. But there's no time. And that had me thinking, if I had time, is that an interesting or is it a profound measure of importance or impact? And as we heard from a session this morning, popularity is not necessarily, in fact often isn't, a measure of influence and impact. And so it got me thinking, with a 251-year-old institution that was founded by artists and architects, that's had a very checkered history, that has no state funding, and therefore is dependent on the number of people who come and the number of people who pay to be members or to see our exhibitions to keep the whole institution alive. Actually, is that something that we should just take for granted? And is the idea that driving mass audiences to our museums and cultural institutions, to our online platforms, is that something that is unquestionably what we all believe in? Should art be something that necessarily is appealing to all? Is it something that is almost medicinal-like that we feed, or is there something more nuanced and complex about our aspirations to reach the broadest possible audiences? Finally, in a culture, certainly where I come from in Britain, but I've seen it across Europe and in particularly in America, expertise seems to be something denigrated. So is this something that we should fight for? Is elitism not necessarily a dirty word? And are liberal institutions, by definition, sometimes a little too sensitive to that kind of criticism? To help me debate this in the 38 minutes we've got left, I've got 3 panelists. First, Lars Nitva, who's been a director of 4 major museums over the last 30 years, the Louisiana near Copenhagen, the inaugural director of Tate Modern, the Moderna Museum in Stockholm, and most recently M+ in Hong Kong. Lars Nitva.
Thank you.
Farrokh Chowdhury is a former dancer, now an executive producer for various dance companies, was co-founder of the Akram Khan company, but also has been working with Yang Liping in China, as well as English ballet. Farrokh Chowdhury. And finally, Munira Mirza, who is an academic, a commentator, who's executive director of a new cultural institution at King's College London, but also was Deputy Mayor for Culture and Education from 2008 to 2016, including the London Olympics. Munira Mirza. Lars Nitva, the narrative over the past 3 decades, which may or may not be totally coincidental, as that's the time that you've been running 4 institutions, is that more and more people are going to museums. And this is a good thing, it's cultural momentum, and it's something we all subscribe to. Can you just briefly chart that narrative in a more nuanced way and just unpick how important popularity and the spectre of populism is?
Oh dear. I mean, yesterday when we met briefly, I mean, you suggested I had reached the age when it was time to start to write sort of my autobiography. And
this is a
actually,
rehearsal.
I am at that point, I guess, when you start thinking about really, I mean, why have you been doing what you've been doing in your life and looking back at it? And of course, I've come to the conclusion that, I mean, I studied at the Stockholm School of Economics, and then in the 70s, and then I was struck by some artwork, some exhibitions that really changed the whole idea of who I was and what it was to be a person living in this rapidly changing society and so forth. So really there was a clear before and after. And I think now when I look back at that, I can see myself as a missionary, basically. You know, I think what I've been doing all these years is being a missionary, believing that some people, you should give access to these experiences, and that some people might have, you know, sort of eureka, fantastic, amazing, life-changing experiences from art. But of course, not expecting that art always does something to people. I think to some it doesn't matter at all, and it will not be important. And so I think that's been driving me all the way through. And I think what's been the key thing is really, I sound almost like an old Minister of Culture in the UK, Chris Smith or so, excellence and access. You know, that on one hand, you should be absolutely uncompromising because there is a real value. I believe, and I think people who work in our field believe that the material, the things, the ideas that we're working with are extremely important and they shouldn't be compromised. At the same time, you shouldn't sort of have higher thresholds than necessary in order to create that meeting. So for me, it's in a way always been simple. That's been the driver, that be totally uncompromising. You have sort of two clients, you can say. You have on one hand, you have the art or the artists, and then you have the public or the audiences, plural. And you have to optimize for these two parties. And I think that's been the driver all the way for me, and I think for many who work in this field. But of course, there are many other pressures that are in play also. And one of them is, of course, what you mentioned. Now the statistics for the big museums have come out, and the Louvre in Paris hits higher records than ever, and the Met hits higher records than ever. And then you wonder, is it because of a certain music video that was sort of filmed in the Louvre, or is it because of the art? And so there are many factors that are in play. But I think the trajectory has been, yes, bigger audiences, more people in the museums, especially on Sunday afternoons. And I think the driver for that has been, museums have actually lowered the threshold. So there are more and other audiences coming to the museums than before. And I think that possibly the rising number of visitors, museum goers, also has to do with the digital development, both because, as we learned in the previous session, digital development actually can help raise curiosity and interest in art. But also, I think there is a sort of counter action in a way, that you actually long for this thing that you can only experience standing there in front of it in that room. I can lecture about this or talk for a long time about it, and I shouldn't do that. I think we'll come back to it, but this is like the scenario we've been through.
It's interesting how you measure. It's very difficult to measure the quality of experience in an art museum or gallery. Certainly with dance, you have, when people make a commitment to come to the performance, Farouk, you have a captive audience in theory for the duration of the performance. Not always, but most of the time. I get obsessed with the time people spend in exhibitions. You know, that actually 45 minutes in a vast exhibition compared to 3.5 hours. The institution, I suppose, from an economic point of view, loves people to go in quickly, but as a curator and someone who's put on exhibitions, I want people to spend a lot of time in front of the objects that we've brought into this kind of communal space. How do you respond to that kind of binary position, which Lars did in a beautiful way, that there's uncompromising belief in what you're programming and the desire to, in a sense, get bigger audiences, so thresholds have to be lowered. Are the two completely different things, or is there a common ground?
It's part of an ecology. You know, I always like to believe that the audience actually finishes the creative process for us. They're kind of the final collaborator. And we shouldn't see them as someone who just experienced it. They're part of that continuum. And I know that many artists, you know, the ones I've worked with, certainly wouldn't want their work to be seen by the elite, a few people, and certainly people who are in the know, because the people in the know are more likely to mythologize them in the way that they're getting, you know, as they get more popular, that begins to happen to them. So certainly we're looking for, as wide a possible audience as possible, but also I think what we as a dance company, and particularly working with Akram Khan, what we're trying to achieve is this experience where someone goes away and says, like, you know what? Your story is my story. And so it becomes not just a question of numbers and that, you know, we've got great numbers over the years, but we certainly didn't start out popular. You know, we started out experimenting, taking risks, not softening our radical thinking or our creativity. It really was kind of, you know, this desire to root ourselves in something that was personal and meaningful to the people, the creative team working on it. And hopefully if we do that well enough, it engages the public. But the danger of popularity is then you begin to start trying to keep those numbers. It's that kind of age-old thing. Once you achieve it, then you spend the rest of your energy trying to keep it. And I think, in a way, the populism is the kind of disease, you know, if I dare to use that word, that comes out of it, because then you're trying to think, well, we've got this number of people, then how do we get more? And how do we just bring them in for the sake of it? And I remember once listening to David Glass talk, you know, an artist spends a whole, you know, many, many years trying to find their voice, and then the rest of their career trying to get rid of it. And you're trying to get rid of it while you're dragging people and expecting them to see the old voice. So it's a complex thing, and I do I do think art, look, we don't have any issue with elitism in sports. We don't have any issue with elitism in business. So why should we have an issue with elitism in arts? We're looking for people who excel, who seek to, who go beyond the familiar and the obvious, who show us a new vision of the world. The only difference is, I think, in art, it takes longer for people to kind of engage and understand their experience and kind of build up a tolerance to be rerouted. That doesn't just happen immediately. And then if we look through history, look, Stravinsky, 1913, people booing it off the stage. And now it's been done, 100 different dance companies. I've just spent last week making a Tibetan-inspired Rite of Spring using Stravinsky music with a Chinese choreographer. And this is where it's led to, and I can tell you times when Akram went to India 20 years ago with a piece of work where when in the post-show discussion, one half were the purists complaining that we should not have this kind of work, and one half were saying that we need this kind of work. 15 years on, these two things have converged into a very interesting new dynamic. So, I don't want to start saying artists are ahead of the time because that sounds like really like, they have some kind of special gift. But I do believe, yes, you want to get to a point where people engage with the art, but you don't want to do it for the sake of it. And you don't want, and curators and producers should not be caught up in that game of actually having to, just for the sake of numbers, because who really knows what that experience means? It's like a football game. I love football, right? And they show you the stats. Arsenal had 86% possession of the ball, but it was rubbish. It doesn't say anything about the true experience of what you actually saw. And I don't think we have to be preoccupied with trying to paternalistically tell people what benefit they're going to get from that experience. We just need to open the door, let them in, and let them decide for themselves. And I don't think these experiences are about giving people something that they don't have. Actually, people do have something. It's actually just unlocking that. Their imagination, their curiosity, to be able to kind of let that be something that's very personal for them. Sorry, this was a bit of a meandering answer to your question, Tim, but...
Well, I couldn't agree with you more about Arsenal playing 80% rubbish.
I'm sure you're not an Arsenal fan.
No, certainly not, no, we can unpack. Manira, I don't want to fall into the trap, but I'm about to, of blaming politicians for everything. But you have a frontline experience of politics and cultural policy. And politicians, by definition, and in a sense, it's not their fault, but they have to judge things numerically, broadly speaking. It's how they get elected in democracies, and it's how all success, it seems to be measured. How was it for you, working as a deputy mayor for culture, in terms of delivering broader audiences, and how much were you under pressure to follow a popular, if not populist, agenda?
It wasn't an external pressure. It was felt very deeply, actually, by myself, my team. I think being in London, particularly when I started about 10 years ago, there was a really strong feeling from the cultural sector that engaging with the public, reaching large numbers, creating art that felt relevant and had meaning to people's lives was a kind of philosophy, really, that people held with integrity. So, obviously there are funders who ask for numbers and want to tick boxes, but I think that is very much an internalized thing, that people really believe it. I agree completely with Lars and Farouk in that I think they've articulated the fact that you can have two ideas in your head at the same time. You can believe in excellence, in the authority of the expert, in an elite understanding of culture and the arts, whilst at the same time absolutely believing that people out there, the audience, the public, can engage with it. And it's that process. I loved your phrase, Lars, of being a missionary. It's about wanting to convert and persuade, and having confidence in what you believe and what you feel about art. It may be that you're a curator, you spent a lifetime thinking about art, knowing about it, and wanting to share that, and that the public can be brought to it. I think the interesting thing, my career, I suppose, looking back now, just doing my autobiography, I've thought about this question for a long time. I've worked in the realm of public art through my role in London government. I've been involved in a digital project called Henny Talks, which was about creating films that told the story of art history and great works of art in an accessible way. And in my current role at King's, we bring artists and cultural organisations into the university to try and break down the walls of the ivory tower and to try and engage the public in research and education in ways that universities traditionally haven't done. And it's a very similar process to what's happening in museums and galleries in the art sector. But I think, you know, we could spend the rest of the session agreeing with each other about how important it is to engage the public. The thing that I find really interesting now is the parallel between politics and culture, in that even though everybody has talked very much about engaging the public and wanting to be more relevant to the public, there has been a populist turn, and populism is used as a pejorative term. Nobody ever says, I'm a populist. It's used about other people because it's a way of attacking somebody for appealing to the public. And I think if you look at the political context, Brexit, the rise of Trump, in the arts world, there has been a pulling away from the idea that the public have something to contribute. There's a kind of, and you saw this particularly in Britain with the reaction to Brexit from the art sector, talking about the people who voted for Brexit as being uneducated, ignorant about cultural diversity, ignorant about the facts. And there was almost a kind of, ironically, after all this time spent trying to engage the public, trying to talk to them on their terms, trying to treat them as equals, there was a moment after that vote where it felt like the mask slipped for some people. And maybe the art sector is not as inclusive and as engaged with the rest of the country and with society as it likes to think. Maybe that echo chamber, that elitist bubble still exists. And it's not the elitist bubble of the past, which would have been about a very almost aristocratic view of culture, as something that only rich and educated people could have.
The connoisseurial tradition.
The connoisseurial tradition, yeah. This was from a part of the art sector which thinks of itself as very liberal and left-leaning and, you know, about the, you know, engaging the public. And so I don't know how to explain that contradiction, but it's something that's opened up in the last few years, and we can't run away from it.
Alarm bells. Go on, yeah.
No, I was thinking about, I mean, the word populism and what it says, what it means in relationship to art. I mean, the way I see it is that, I mean, we have art institutions, and society sort of supports art because we think there is a value that is important, and there is a sort of a consensus around that. And when I would use the word populism is when the carriage is in front of the horse. There are other things that are driving the content and what you do and why you do it than actually the content and the sort of the core of the reason, the raison d'etre for the art institution, in a sense. So, I mean, and then I think populism stays as a negative thing, but I understand what you mean, that it can also be excluding in a way that is problematic. I had one more thing. You mentioned before, I mean, you said a qualitative experience, I think. And is there a qualitative experience? Have we lost that somewhere? And I think it depends on who you are as an audience. I mean, you indicated that actually there are multiple audiences. And I mean, in audience research, I mean, they usually work with 5 different categories. And I think 2 of these categories, which are the sort of those who basically been there, seen that, tick the box on the bucket list, and those who are called usually the facilitators, those who go there in order to bring others into the field of the museums. They love it in Tate Modern on a Sunday afternoon when it's sort of heaving and you can't see anything, and so forth, because it confirms exactly that experience of what their identity as visitors sort of suggests they should be experiencing. So they are totally fulfilled by that experience, while the other categories, maybe those who are, I mean, the most extreme are the pilgrims, where I probably belong to that category now, who actually look for a very particular experience and
quiet
reflection. Yeah,
quiet.
They suffer badly.
But isn't it the thing about this audience as target group? You know, this group of people and ignoring the pluralistic kind of nature of society now. We're not. I mean, I think there's an interesting interview with David Bowie, with Jeremy Paxman in '99, talking about the internet, and he was saying in the '60s there was a singular truth, and then we began to discover that there is a duality to the way we are, and then we moved into this pluralistic thing, and that makes it more complex in terms of understanding these groups of audiences. But the danger of populism, for me, working with artists, is that then artists are then become the intermediaries between these institutions and these theatres and the audience. They have to then be driven by social and political imperatives that are not of their choice to fulfill that need. And there is the danger, if it tips over the edge and starts happening like this, we won't get the kind of work that will begin to challenge and take people, and offer new visions of the world, that will bring people in and arouse curiosity.
Well, that's always the fear, isn't it? That both practitioners, creative practitioners and curators, the fear is that their expertise, their vision, their understanding of what they do will be compromised by institutions that insist they behave in a certain way.
Absolutely.
But is that actually borne out in reality?
Well, I think there is this interesting tension emerging, and tension is good for art and culture in a way, and it'd be interesting to see where this pushes something out, because art, I think, is a bit like weeds under the concrete. If it can't find a gap, artists, they find something somewhere else. So it would be interesting to see how this manifests itself, in the future, and with the advent of the digital age and stuff, and in a way, digital age being really good for dance. Because actually human beings always are looking for counterbalance. They want flesh, blood, time and space. They want real oxygen. And so people are visiting the theatre to see dance more often than ever before. And also what's also interesting is that this kind of, the commercial and the experimental artists are beginning to work more closely together. And there's a new creative dynamic and vitality that's growing out of this. So perhaps it's a way that, organized institutions begin to communicate this change in a very creative way that keeps people coming in, and ensuring that. I mean, there are lots of people coming, and that's great. We've got great numbers, like I said, but I still my fear is it could lead to mediocrity and laziness, and that's the last thing we need.
Before I just ask Manir about that, I just want to pick up on one thing. You told me earlier that one of your briefs in China with Yang Liping, who is so popular, is to make her less popular. I love the idea that you're the man called in to make someone less popular, but how does that play out?
Well, the thing is, she's like, as a Yang Liping, for people who don't know, is China's most iconic choreographer. And almost like this Madonna-type status, literally everywhere you go, people stop on the street. And she's been working for 40 years now, and now she wants to be more experimental in the way she works and get her work seen out of China. Now that means taking a lot more risk, which has actually been quite controversial in China, because people are thinking, what the hell is she doing? She's not doing what we're used to. And she's taking this risk to go into a Western market, which could potentially make her unpopular. But that's not a bad thing. I think for an artist, it's not a bad thing to be in that place where you get a little bit fear creeps back into the way you create. You're uncertain, doubt, and all those things, and contradiction begins to drive your decision-making process. Because in those spaces is where all the interesting ideas begin to kind of take shape. So yeah, it's really, I wonder how she's going to take it after 40 years of being immensely popular and going in an international marketplace and finding that she's not getting the audiences she's used to.
Manir, you articulated the fact that liberal institutions are perhaps not as tolerant and as open as they think they are. What's the solution in that regard?
Well, I think part of it comes out of a good impulse, which is to believe in their own authority and the quality of what they do, and to have a sense of their own history and the legitimacy of their viewpoints. But I think expertise has its limitations.
Do you now?
I won't say we've had enough of experts, because I think expertise does have its, it's central to the lifeblood of a museum or a gallery. Otherwise, how could we possibly justify funding them? Why should you be the artistic director of the Royal Academy of Arts and not me? What qualifies you? Because you've spent a lifetime studying art, and you have gained the experience and the knowledge about art in a way that most ordinary people won't have time or capacity to do. So we have to believe in the value of the art that's in the museum, and the choices that dictate that value have legitimacy. But you as an expert cannot hope to predict which art in the future will appeal to the public. You can have a good guess at it, but you can't absolutely guarantee. There's no formula, there's no absolute precision or certainty in expertise. There are limitations to any subject, really. And I think that's where the engagement with the public as a different perspective becomes very useful. It's the exact same in politics. Politicians can say everything they know about the economy. They can't predict where it will go. They can't predict human behavior and human subjective reactions.
No, that's true. And politicians perhaps should be more visionary, but have to be reactive. But I do think expertise in the arts sector is also, there's an element of agenda setting. And that you're right, I can't predict what the audience will want in 5 years' time, but I can have a go at actually trying to define public taste, broaden public taste. Now, when I articulate it in those terms, I sound like the elitist artistic director of an organisation that has royal assent, which I am. But I can do that because we're an independent organisation. If I were the director of a state-funded museum, that may be challenged more. Although, actually, I think we're all playing the same game's the wrong word, but we're in the same area.
The key word is really public trust, because
Yeah.
it sort of combines the two things. Public trust means that the public actually looks at you because you're an expert, and that actually you make choices and present things that are, and they trust you for some reason, which means that there must be a dialogue between you, the institution, the expert, and the public. So ultimately, and this holds true in politics, of course, as well, that public trust is, and that's actually one of the success criteria, I think, for any public institution also, that they can, you get the impression that there is public trust. And typically, that has to do with visitor numbers, ultimately, not only because that's the institution, for example, that gets big numbers, not only for the well-known exhibitions, the big names and so, but actually for things that people have never heard of. But they trust the institutions, they still go there. And because they trust that this is a good choice, it's going to be interesting for me.
Can I just add to that? I mean, the thing about the expert, because I've learned just recently from my China experience, I consider myself to be a dance expert. But actually, I go to China with this woman who has a completely different context. And my expertise, I had to really rein it in sometimes and hold back and allow myself to have a new perspective of this context, which I'm unfamiliar with, because everything is this kind of strange dynamic between intention, action, and context. And you can't, an expert can only be an expert maybe in intention and action, but context shifts. So it's an interesting thing. My expertise was challenged, and there's a danger in the expert assuming things that can, are not creating space for something new. But in saying that, going back to the sports analogy, I wouldn't want my PE instructor training our top athlete to win a gold medal. Right, and we don't question that. No one goes, oh no, they should not be doing that, that's not fair. We should allow, we want people to be aspirational. We want people to take risks. We want people to fail, but fail with excellence. Artists do fail, that's what they're there for. Yeah. They make mistakes all the time and they fail, and that should be allowed to happen, because without failure, we do not have progress.
I think trust is the key here, actually. I think you're right about institutions gaining a certain kind of public trust if they're popular, but I think also they gain trust through credibility, and a noble failure rather than a cynical attempt to generate a mass audience with a kind of exhibition that is half-cocked and obviously going for certain big names and is done in a bad way will lose more public trust than it will gain. Before I throw it to the floor, because I really want us to take questions and observations from the floor on this session, just one brief question about museum and institutional competitiveness. I mean, one of the things we have to do at the Royal Academy is be collegial, because we have a very limited, quirky, quality-ridden in part collection, but we have to work with other institutions as partners in all sorts of different ways. And I believe that actually is the way forward for museums. And actually I find other museums incredibly generous in lending and partnering up with exhibitions. But there is a healthy and sometimes unhealthy competition between institutions in cities, in countries, across nations. Is that inevitable, and is that driving excellence, Munira, or is that a kind of, is my questioning of competitiveness a kind of liberal wetness from the 1980s that saw all competitive sports taken out of schools in Britain, for example?
Well, it's like as I said before, having two ideas in your head at the same time. It does drive excellence in the sense that it raises people's game. If the Royal Academy does a fantastic exhibition, Tate Modern feels that it has to raise its game and go out and get the next big artist, or try and appeal to the same marketplace, as it were. The problem is that you then have this race to the bottom, as it were, and you're trying very hard to appeal to the largest possible audience, and that's when you stop taking risks and experimenting. And it's about having the ecology, the balance of the experimental alongside the blockbusters. That's the kind of language that museums talk about now, isn't it? That they have to think about the mixed economy. They do, but
and they can do it within museums. If you're running 5 exhibitions at the same time in one institution, as many of the big institutions are, there's no excuse for not having a mixed ecology. But what about collaboration between museums where there is a kind of agreement in a particular city or a particular place or at a particular time where there is this kind of balance, where everyone isn't necessarily racing for the same kind of audiences?
No, but I think it's right that of course there are pluses and minuses in this. The minus is, and I think that will end up in my memoirs, but that's the power games that are being played, where sometimes the institution that actually has the most passion for showing a particular artist or something like that is, when a more powerful institution sees that this is something we should be doing because we'll bring in big audiences also, actually makes it. Some of them have power to kill that idea in that museum, to take the idea themselves. And so there are negative energies in play also, and that's not good for anybody. But there are also, of course, it's a healthy competition. You raise your game, and that's good.
I have to agree, really. I think the mixed programming it's happening everywhere, even in dance. Look, Sadler's Wells, which is one of the most famous dance houses in the world, it has a really mixed bag. It has the Peacock Theatre. You have stuff that's very experimental. You have stuff that's really easy and accessible. It doesn't mean that one's actually, one thing I think I just want to address there, doesn't mean one is harder to make than the other. They both require a great deal of rigor and crafting, and actually, if anything, I think the popular work, is actually more like, is under greater pressure to succeed, because if it fails big. There's a lot of money behind it, and there's so much work that's popular. The experimental artists can actually, they're much more in a little niche space, which is actually a little bit more safeguarded. And they're also allowed that kind of audience, the kind of loyalty we were talking about, because I think experimental work is kind of product-led rather than market-led. So people follow it because they know they might have to go on some of those failures along the way and be part of that experience. So they're both difficult.
Okay, on that nuanced note, let's throw it to the floor. We've got 6 minutes. Wait for the yellow microphone block. If you could also just identify who you are and where you're from.
No.
Question here. Okay, then
I'm Mohammed Kano. I'm a troublemaker artist type of character. And it intrigues me that you mentioned trying to experiment while being safe at the same time. I'm getting that type of feel. The Royal Academy, they have their beautiful summer exhibition in which artists from all different types and all fields. And I find that to be the most invigorating and most interesting exhibit when I go to London in summer to attend. When we talk about dance, I attended the Abu Dhabi Festival, supported Barry Kosky, Carmen with the Royal Opera House in London. And taking that and redefining the context of same music, but it was presented in a completely different way. And I found that to be far more invigorating and more interesting and more appealing and more attractive than the day-to-day mundane things. Shabak in London, that many artists from the Arab world were able to participate for the first time in a British context. This for us was a great stepping stone. How do you expand that? How do you move that around the world? Sorry to be such a long question.
I always say when people want to recreate the summer exhibition that I do it completely differently to how it was done originally, but it's gone on for 251 years. It's never had a break, even during world wars, and it is as democratic an art exhibition as it's possible to have. I mean, the members of the Royal Academy have a certain number of works they can put in, but they do open submission and they select. Curatorially, of course, it's sniffed at, because it's a ragbag of the brilliant, the banal, cat paintings, Anselm Kiefer's new work. And it's that mixture that I think means that audiences spend longer in that exhibition, almost than any other exhibition that we do in the year at the Academy. So the public engagement is huge. You may argue they're bemused because they're trying to find a route through 1,200 works stacked high, floor to ceiling on the wall. But it's interesting that exhibition funds the schools at the Academy, and also funds some of the programming that will be loss-making later in the year. So in a sense, it's doing the job. But I'm not sure many institutions in Britain certainly would want to reinvent or would want to do that from the beginning. But how do we spread cultural models of
I mean, first of all, I think it's, I mean, speaking from 40 years in the business now, I mean, you can say, I mean, the landscape has changed tremendously. I mean, if we use this sort of tired word diversity, but I mean, it's the diversity in all, I think, public institutions, cultural institutions almost around the world is so much higher than it was, say, 30 years ago.
And the scale.
Huge, and scale, but also the level of difference and surprise is much higher now than before, actually. So I think it is moving in the direction that you describe generally, and that's why you've had these experiences also, of course, in different places. You wouldn't have had these kinds of experiences 30 years ago to the same extent. So I think there is a movement, of course, and there is an opening and so.
But I hope there's symbiosis. I mean, I hope that the established institutions need to learn from elsewhere.
Yeah, no, sure.
Gentleman there, yeah.
Yes, good afternoon. My name is Sarim Al-Azawi. I'm an oil man with a love for art, and I just wanted to ask, how would you stop the race to the bottom? Everybody's talking about that, and of course the discussion here about the popular versus populist has taken this sort of line where there is a problem with the fact that art should be popular, which is very much against many of the ideas that were discussed and very popular at the end of the 19th century, in the 20s, and that were violently interrupted by the First World War and the Second World War and so on. I was wondering if education and the way that we actually view education has got anything to do with that, just like what Sir Ken Robinson was saying when we put mathematics and engineering, unfortunately my kind of sphere, right at the top and everything else at the very, very bottom.
Let's Munira, because you've been working on education, you talked about the Henny podcast, but certainly, and I don't want this just to be about Britain, but from the experience that we come from, the denigration of the liberal arts and arts in particular on the curriculum seems to be a problem in the West, but particularly in Britain at the moment. Education presumably is one of the ways that we stop the race to the bottom.
Absolutely. I think it's about recognising that creativity in many different forms, not just in the arts, is a really important aspect of education. I happen to believe that an academic curriculum can deliver those things, but unfortunately there is a tendency to see only the sciences and maths as being the only viable kind of career path for many young people. And interestingly, actually, in parts of certainly in Asia, there's an interest in how to teach arts education. There's a recognition that balance needs to be there, just at a time where it's being lost to some extent in the West. But I think the point is about different perspectives. Sometimes the advocates of creativity go too far to another extreme and say, well, science and maths, it's all very well, but really creativity is the most important thing. And you get into this kind of zero-sum game. It's not about the expert or the public, it's about both. It's not about the Western or the non-Western, it's about both. The gentleman mentioned the Shubak Festival, which I was involved in setting up. That was about a meeting between contemporary Arab artists and artists in London and in different regions. It's that dialogue between these different perspectives that I think gives energy and life to the art forms, to the institutions. And so everybody needs to be on their guard about their own echo chamber, their own expertise, because there are limits to how much we can know.
Nicely put. And that's in fact what the dialogue is. That dialogue is at the centre of what this conference, this summit is about, and it's actually one of the ways that we're going to find action points moving forward. We didn't get a chance to talk about accountability or responsibility. Who arts institutions are responsible to, their audiences or their funders. That's something we're going to address, I think, in the workshop later this afternoon. And also, we may pick up on this idea of education, among other things. But for now, we're bang on time, so thank you all.
Thank you.